It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the courtroom, the usual hum of whispers filling the air as people settled into their seats. The faint click of high heels echoed as the bailiff called the next case. It was a day like any other at the county courthouse, until the name was read aloud. John Michael Williams. The room fell silent. The name hung in the air like a secret, heavy and full of mystery. For a moment, no one spoke, and everyone glanced around, unsure of why this name seemed to carry more weight than the others. But for Judge Helen Foster, the name triggered something far more significant, something no one in the courtroom was expecting. "Is Mr. Williams here?" the judge asked, her voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. The defendant, a man in his mid-40s, shuffled forward. His clothes were torn, his hair disheveled, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had spent far too many nights on the street. John Michael Williams wasn't just another name on the docket. He was a homeless veteran, one of thousands, but this particular case had something more. The judge's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. As she scanned the paperwork in front of her, she paused, almost as if she had recognized something. What if the name meant more than just a number? What if, in that one moment, a simple act of fate could change everything? "Mr. Williams," Judge Foster began, her voice sharp, "you've been accused of trespassing on public property, but I'm curious about something." She leaned forward, eyes never leaving his face. "How did you end up here?" John's eyes flickered for a moment. The courtroom, cold and imposing, suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on him. He wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Not by a judge, someone who would decide his fate. But something in the way she asked made him feel like this wasn't just a routine case. This was different. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I was in the army," he said quietly. "Came back home and, life was never the same. Lost everything." His voice cracked. "My family, my home. Now I'm just here, just trying to survive." The words hung in the air, a truth so raw that it seemed to hit the room with a weight none of them were prepared for. A few people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, but no one spoke. Judge Foster's gaze softened, but only for a moment. She wasn't here to be sympathetic. She was here to do her job, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to John's story. Something bigger. "Do you mind if I ask, are you the same John Michael Williams who served with a certain group during the Gulf War?" she asked, her voice growing more measured. John blinked in surprise. Yeah. I served with a few men who were, well, I don't know if they're still around. We went through a lot together." Judge Foster nodded, her eyes not leaving him. "Interesting," she muttered, almost to herself. She flipped through her papers again, but this time, there was a shift. "John, you're not just any veteran. Your name is linked to something else. Something significant." John felt his stomach tighten. What was she talking about? "You were part of a mission," she continued, "a mission that saved the life of someone who went on to do something extraordinary, someone who, as of today, is one of the richest men in the world." John's breath caught in his throat. "I don't know what you mean. I never thought about it. That was, years ago. It's all a blur." Judge Foster looked at him with a strange glint in her eyes. "I think you do know exactly what I mean, Mr. Williams. Because that man, the one you helped, has changed the world. And he may just be the key to changing your life as well." A wave of confusion washed over John. He glanced at the judge, trying to read her face. His thoughts raced. Who was she talking about? Who could have made a difference in his life now? And then it hit him. "Wait, you're talking about Elon Musk?" John's voice barely rose above a whisper, but the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge's lips curled into a faint smile. "Yes, Mr. Williams. Elon Musk. The man you saved." John's mind reeled. He didn't understand. How could a billionaire like Musk possibly be tied to him, a homeless, forgotten veteran. He had long since given up on the idea that anyone from his past, especially someone with such power and influence, would remember him. But here, in this moment, the name Musk was all he could hear. Judge Foster looked at the bailiff. "Call Elon Musk's office immediately. I believe it's time for a conversation." She turned back to John. "This is no longer just a case of trespassing. You found yourself at the center of something much larger than you ever imagined." The murmurs in the courtroom intensified as the judge made her decision. She was no longer looking at John, the homeless veteran, but at someone who had unknowingly been part of a much bigger story, a story that was about to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. The bailiff returned to the room moments later, holding his phone to his ear, and after a few short exchanges, he nodded to the judge. "Mr. Musk will speak with you now, Your Honor." Judge Foster, without missing a beat, picked up the phone. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke, and for a brief moment, John felt as though the entire world was waiting on the other end of the line. "Mr. Musk," she said firmly, "I have someone here you may want to meet. You might want to hear what John Michael Williams has to say." John could hardly breathe. What was going to happen now? Would Musk actually care? Would he even remember the name of the man who had saved his life so many years ago? And what would that mean for him, a man who had nothing left to lose? As Judge Foster hung up the phone and looked at him, her gaze full of something resembling hope, she simply said, "Mr. Williams, you're about to change your life. And possibly the lives of others." The words hit him like a wave. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. The name Musk had changed his future in ways he could never have imagined. And it was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? John Michael Williams stood in the courthouse, dazed, still processing what had just happened. He had lived most of his life in a fog, surviving day by day, numbing the pain of his past, trying to outrun the memories that had haunted him ever since he left the army. He'd never thought he'd be caught up in a story like this, a story that seemed too absurd to be real. Elon Musk. The name echoed in his mind like a distant thunderstorm, something so far out of his reach, yet now somehow connected to him. The same man whose companies dominated the headlines. The visionary entrepreneur. The billionaire. How could someone like him have anything to do with John? As Judge Foster hung up the phone, the murmurs in the courtroom slowly began to fade. The moment felt unreal, like some twisted dream he couldn't wake up from. People were still talking, but John couldn't focus on their words. His thoughts were miles away, lost in the haze of his memories. For a brief moment, his gaze drifted back to the time before everything fell apart. Back to when he was John Michael Williams, proud soldier, husband, and father. A man who once had a life, a future. It wasn't always perfect, but it was his. He remembered his days in the army like they were yesterday. He wasn't special by any means, just a regular guy from a small town. But when he enlisted, something inside him clicked. He wanted to serve his country. He wanted to make a difference. In Iraq, he and his team had been tasked with a dangerous mission. It was meant to be quick, straightforward, and easy, something that wouldn't require much. But nothing ever went as planned. The mission quickly turned into a nightmare. The enemy had ambushed them, and in the chaos of the firefight, John had saved the life of a fellow soldier, a man he hadn't known then, but would later learn was Elon Musk's best friend from his early days in the military. The bullet had grazed his leg, but it was enough to put him out of action. John had carried him out of the line of fire, risking his own life to ensure his comrade's safety. He didn't think much of it at the time. In fact, he barely thought about it at all when he returned home. But now, years later, as fate would have it, that simple act had come back to find him in the most unexpected way. John had never known the man he saved was connected to someone so powerful. And even if he had, he never could have imagined it would matter. After all, he was just a vet. A guy who had lost everything, a man whose life had fallen apart after he returned home. The relationships he had built before, his marriage, his friendship, were gone. His wife, Sarah, had left him after his return from the war. She couldn't understand the darkness that lingered inside him, the nightmares that wouldn't fade. She tried to help, but it was never enough. And in the end, it wasn't even the war that drove them apart. It was the man he had become afterward. His job prospects had vanished with his self-esteem. No one wanted to hire a veteran who couldn't even get his life together, who had too much baggage, who had trouble trusting people. Every rejection letter that came through his mailbox felt like another weight on his chest. And then there was his son, Ben. His little boy who was only 5 when John left for Iraq. Ben didn't remember much of his father before the war. By the time John came home, Ben was already growing up without him, forming a bond with Sarah that John could never replace. The distance between them grew until it became insurmountable. He had tried to stay in contact with Ben after the divorce, tried to stay involved in his life, but it wasn't the same. Ben was already pulling away. And after a year or two, even the phone calls stopped. And so, John found himself here. On the streets. Alone. Now, in this courtroom, with Judge Foster's gaze upon him, everything felt surreal. How could someone like Elon Musk, who had been far too busy changing the world with his companies, rockets, and electric cars, care about a man like him? A homeless veteran with no home, no family, no future. Judge Foster's voice cut through his reverie. Mr. Williams, the next steps are important, but before we move forward, I want to make sure you understand what's happening here. John turned his attention back to her. She was looking at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Her expression was hard to read, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, something like hope. You have a second chance here, Mr. Williams, she said softly. And it's not just because of what you did in the past. It's because of who you are now, and the chance you still have to turn your life around. I've spoken with Mr. Musk's team, and we're exploring ways to help you, but it's going to take effort on your part too. John blinked, still unsure if he could process what she was saying. A second chance. The words didn't make sense. He hadn't even thought about a second chance. For years, he had only been trying to survive. The idea of redemption, of being helped by someone like Elon Musk, it felt too far-fetched. Judge Foster's next words cut through his confusion. I know this is overwhelming, but I'm asking you to trust me, Mr. Williams. Musk is offering more than just a donation. He's offering a partnership. He's willing to help you get back on your feet, but he needs to know that you're committed. The room seemed to grow quieter. The buzz of conversation outside the courtroom, the shuffling of papers, it all faded as John's mind raced. He couldn't fathom what this meant for him. A partnership with Elon Musk? A billionaire offering to help a homeless vet? Could this really be happening? Judge Foster stood up and motioned for John to follow her. Come with me. Let's talk about what happens next. John hesitated for a moment. The idea of taking a step toward the unknown was terrifying. But the thought of staying where he was, trapped in the same endless cycle of failure, was even worse. He stood up, and for the first time in a long time, a small spark of hope flickered inside him. Maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over yet. The air outside the courthouse was crisp, the early morning chill cutting through John's worn-out jacket. He hadn't felt the cold this intensely in years, not since he'd started living on the streets. Most of the time, he was numb to everything, numb to hunger, numb to fear, numb to the pain of being forgotten. But today, it was different. The weight of the unknown was pressing down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried. Judge Foster led him down a narrow corridor, her heels clicking against the linoleum floors, echoing in the otherwise empty space. John followed a few steps behind, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. Elon Musk. The name still felt foreign to him, unreal. He had served in the army, helped save someone's life in a war half a world away, and now here he was, being given a chance at something he never thought possible. They reached a small conference room at the back of the courthouse, and the door creaked as Judge Foster pushed it open. Inside, the room was sparsely furnished, a long table in the center surrounded by chairs. But what caught John's attention immediately was the man sitting at the table, his sharp features and intense gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. He didn't look like the type of person who'd be sitting in a room like this. This man, he was someone who belonged in boardrooms, not county courthouses. His presence filled the space, and John instinctively straightened his posture. "This is Mr. Richard Porter," Judge Foster said as she closed the door behind them. "He's from Mr. Musk's legal team. Richard, this is John Michael Williams." John extended his hand cautiously. The man's handshake was firm, businesslike, but there was something in his eyes, something that made John feel like he wasn't just another case to be dealt with. It was an odd feeling. "Mr. Williams," Richard began, looking him over with a cool professionalism, "we're here because Elon Musk believes in second chances. And he wants to offer you one. But before anything else happens, we need to get a better understanding of where you are, what you need, and how serious you are about turning your life around." John nodded slowly, his mouth dry. He had heard of people getting second chances, heard about it in motivational speeches, in stories about people who overcame the odds. But this? This was real. And the weight of that reality felt almost suffocating. Richard Porter sat back in his chair, folding his arms, his expression unreadable. "Let's start with the basics, Mr. Williams. Where are you now in your life? What's brought you to this point?" John hesitated. It was a simple question, but one that carried so much more weight than he was prepared for. His mind flashed back to the days when he still had a family, a purpose. He had dreams once, hopes for the future. But now, those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else. He rubbed his hands together, trying to steady himself before speaking. I'm homeless," he began. "I don't have a job, no place to call my own. I haven't seen my son in years. My wife, she left me after I came back from the war." He swallowed hard, the familiar lump in his throat appearing again. "I don't know where to go. I don't know how to get out of this." Richard leaned forward, his tone softening ever so slightly. "I understand, Mr. Williams. We're not asking for an instant miracle here. But we need you to be honest with us about your willingness to commit to this process. To change your life. Because no one, least of all Mr. Musk, can do that for you." John's heart pounded in his chest. What was he really willing to do? The thought of starting over felt like a mountain he could never climb. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to do something different. "I'll do whatever it takes," John said, his voice quiet but firm. He looked Richard in the eyes, trying to convey a sense of determination he didn't even feel yet. "I've lost everything, but I'm willing to fight for it. I can't live like this anymore." Richard nodded slowly, almost as if he were weighing John's words. "Good," he said. "Because it's not going to be easy. There will be a lot of work ahead. But if you're ready to take this seriously, then we'll be here to support you. That means training, therapy, possibly a job placement, and a place to live. But we need you to be all in, John." The room was silent for a moment. John felt a rush of conflicting emotions. It was overwhelming to think about rebuilding his life from scratch, to think about confronting the demons that had chased him for so long. The idea of therapy, of revisiting the past that he had buried so deep, was terrifying. But he had no other choice. "I'm ready," he said again, his voice steadier this time. He didn't know if he truly believed it yet, but he had to. He had to try. Richard smiled slightly, nodding. "Good. Now, let's talk logistics. The first thing we need to do is get you into a housing program. We've already arranged for you to stay at one of our partners' properties. It's a safe place for veterans to get back on their feet. You'll have a roof over your head, access to resources, and support from other veterans who've been where you are. John's heart skipped a beat. A roof over his head. It had been so long since he had slept in a bed, let alone somewhere that felt safe. The thought of it almost made him feel emotional, but he forced himself to stay composed. Richard continued, "In the meantime, we'll set up a meeting with a career counselor and a therapist who specializes in post-traumatic stress. You've been through a lot, John. And we want to make sure you're given every tool to succeed." John's mind raced. This was happening. It wasn't a dream. This wasn't some cruel joke. "Thank you," John said, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what to say." Richard gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Just take the first step, Mr. Williams. That's all we're asking." As John walked out of the courthouse, his heart was beating faster than it had in years. There was still so much he didn't know, so many obstacles ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might actually be able to do it. He might actually be able to start over. The world outside the courthouse seemed different now. The sun was shining, the air felt fresher, and even the streets that had once been a source of his shame seemed more like a pathway to a new life. And it all started with that one unexpected name. Elon Musk. John didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he could face it. The first few days in the program felt like a blur. It wasn't so much the whirlwind of change that overwhelmed John, though that was certainly part of it. What really took him by surprise was how much of the process was about unlearning old habits. Habits he had formed over years of surviving on the streets. Habits that had kept him isolated, defensive, and distrustful. John was staying in a modest apartment provided by the program. It wasn't much, barely enough space for the essentials. A small bed, a worn-out sofa, a basic kitchen, and a bathroom that still smelled faintly of mildew. But it was his. The moment he stepped inside, the weight of homelessness, of having no place to belong, finally began to lift. He stared at the walls for hours that night, thinking about his past and trying to make sense of how his life had come to this. There was a dull ache in his chest every time he thought about Ben, his son, and the pain of knowing that he hadn't been there for him when he needed him most. It hurt too much to think about Sarah, his ex-wife, and how she had tried to carry on without him. But now, as he sat on the edge of that simple bed, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he had a shot at something different. A chance to rebuild, not just his life, but his identity. To stop being the man who drifted aimlessly through the world, stuck in the shadows of his own regrets. The next morning, John woke up to a stark reality: he had to get out of his own head. He had to start moving, to embrace the steps ahead, even if they terrified him. He was supposed to meet with the career counselor later that day, but before that, there was something else he needed to do: attend the support group meeting for veterans. At first, the thought of sitting in a circle with strangers and talking about his feelings made him feel nauseous. The last thing he wanted was to sit there and recount his past. It was hard enough living with it, let alone discussing it with people who probably didn't understand. But the program had insisted. It was part of the healing process. They had told him that if he didn't face the trauma head-on, it would continue to haunt him. The meeting room was small, with faded walls and mismatched chairs arranged in a circle. As John entered, a few heads turned, and there were nods of acknowledgement. Most of the men and women in the room looked older than him, some in their 40s or 50s. They wore the signs of life lived on the edge: unshaven faces, tired eyes, and a certain weariness that only time and struggle could bring. "Hey, man, you're new here." One of the men, a tall African-American with a short buzz cut, spoke up. He looked like he had seen his fair share of battles. John nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. "Yeah. Just moved into the program a few days ago. Good to have you." "Name's Eric," the man said with a brief but welcoming smile. He gestured to a chair beside him. "Pull up a seat, brother. We're all here for the same thing." John hesitated, but then he sat down next to Eric. The group had already started their discussion, and John realized that the atmosphere in the room wasn't as intimidating as he had expected. These people weren't judging him, they were survivors, just like him. The facilitator, a woman named Karen, had clearly been doing this for years. Her demeanor was calm, almost maternal, as she guided the group through their weekly check-in. She started by asking each person to share something they had accomplished that week, no matter how small. The responses were varied. One veteran had managed to secure an interview, another had started a new hobby to help ease his anxiety, and someone else had finally been able to get a good night's sleep. When Karen's gaze landed on John, he felt his palms grow clammy. She was kind, but there was a certain expectation in her eyes. She wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "So, John," she said gently, "what's something you're proud of this week? It doesn't matter how small it may seem." John shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He hadn't really done anything of note. He had woken up in his new apartment. He had eaten a meal. But those weren't victories, were they? The silence stretched on, and he could feel everyone's eyes on him. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than usual. I made it to the meeting," he said, almost in disbelief at his own words. "I didn't think I would, but here I am." There was a moment of quiet, and then Eric, sitting beside him, nodded in solidarity. "Hell yeah, man. That's a win. Getting here, getting involved, that's more than most of us can say at the start." The room seemed to breathe with a collective sense of relief, and Karen gave John a reassuring smile. "That's a great first step, John. And remember, there's no right or wrong way to heal. Just take it one day at a time." The session continued, and as the minutes passed, John felt a small sense of camaraderie with the others. They weren't perfect. They weren't fixed. But they were all moving forward in their own ways. And somehow, that gave John the courage to keep going. Later that afternoon, John met with the career counselor, a middle-aged woman named Diane who was warm and approachable. She listened intently as John told her about his struggles, his disjointed attempts at finding work, and his deep sense of guilt for not being the man he once was. Diane's approach was different from what John expected. Rather than offering generic advice or pushing him toward jobs he had no interest in, she helped him identify his strengths, skills that, despite his years of suffering, still resided within him. She talked about transferable skills, how the discipline and leadership he had developed in the army could be assets in the civilian world. She didn't promise him an easy path, but she gave him hope. By the time John left the meeting, he was exhausted, but there was a small fire ignited inside him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in years, John wasn't just existing. He was taking steps to rebuild his life, piece by piece. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. There was still so much uncertainty. Still so much pain to face. But as he looked out the window, the faint glow of the city lights reflecting off the streets, he realized something important. He had a future. And he wasn't going to waste it. The days began to bleed into each other, each one a little bit better than the last. John had slowly started adapting to the structure of his new life. He woke up every morning at the same time, went to the community center for a morning briefing, and participated in group activities with other veterans. It was still difficult. It was strange, in a way, to be part of a system that wasn't designed to just get him through the day, but to actually help him move forward, to create a future where he had choices. The simple routines, waking up, having breakfast, checking in with his counselor, helped anchor him. But even on the good days, there was always a nagging feeling, like a weight on his chest, reminding him that he wasn't done yet. By the time his third week in the program came around, he had begun to feel the pang of reality. He couldn't just leave the past behind. It followed him, like a shadow that never quite went away. John had to confront it. The therapy sessions with his new counselor, Dr. Elizabeth Monroe, had started in earnest. Dr. Monroe was patient, but she had a way of making him face things that he didn't want to. She didn't give him a choice. "John," she said during their second session, her voice calm but firm, "you've been avoiding talking about the war. I can see it in your eyes. You look anywhere but at me when we start going there. But you need to process it. You can't move forward until you do." John's heart started to race. The very thought of the war, of the things he had seen and done, made him want to crawl out of his skin. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk about it, he didn't know how to talk about it. The memories were jagged pieces, scattered and fragmented, and when they came together in his mind, they felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. I don't know if I can do this," John admitted, the words coming out as a confession. "I don't know if I can go back there in my mind. It's too much." Dr. Monroe sat back in her chair, her expression gentle but unwavering. "John, you don't have to relive everything in one session. We're going to take this slow. One step at a time. I just want you to begin by telling me something small, something that stands out to you." John closed his eyes, trying to quiet the storm in his head. He thought about the long days spent in the desert, the weight of his rifle, the tension in his chest as he moved through the heat, always on edge, never feeling safe. There were flashes, brief moments that didn't make sense, people, places, sounds. But it was that one moment that haunted him the most. The one that came rushing back, unbidden, every time he closed his eyes. "We were out on a mission," he began slowly, his voice rough. "It was supposed to be a simple one. Recon, nothing major. But we got ambushed. I don't know what happened to the others. I just remember running, and then hearing gunfire, but all I could think about was staying alive. I thought I saw someone down, and I didn't stop. I didn't check if they were alive or—" He stopped himself, suddenly unable to continue. The silence in the room felt heavy, suffocating. "John," Dr. Monroe said softly, "you don't have to apologize for surviving. You did what you thought was right at the time. That's all any of us can do." It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone in his struggle. There was no judgment in Dr. Monroe's voice, just a quiet understanding that made the weight of his memories just a little bit lighter. Over the next few weeks, John began to make small strides in therapy. Each session felt like a slow unraveling of something deep inside him. He started to confront the things that had caused him so much pain, guilt, shame, anger. It was never easy, but it was necessary. And while the process was exhausting, there was a part of him that felt lighter each time he left the office. On the work front, things were also beginning to move. Diane, the career counselor, had helped John put together a resume that highlighted his military experience, and he had started applying for jobs with the help of the program's job placement assistants. It was a strange feeling, applying for work after so long. For years, John had felt invisible, just another face in the crowd, just another statistic. But now, it was different. Now, he was an applicant. He had skills to offer, experience to share. The first interview was nerve-wracking. It had been years since he had dressed in something other than his old military fatigues or the ragged clothes he had worn on the streets. He had to learn how to speak to an employer again, to look them in the eye and answer questions about his experience. But he did it. He didn't get the job, but he didn't care. The mere fact that he had shown up and put himself out there was a victory in itself. A week later, he had a second interview. This time, it was with a local construction company that specialized in veteran hires. John had experience in manual labor, but he wasn't sure how much that would count for. The interview went smoothly, better than he had expected, and when the interviewer shook his hand at the end and told him they'd be in touch, John felt a small spark of hope. The program also had arranged for him to receive a stipend for food and basic necessities until he could land a job. It wasn't much, but it gave him the breathing room to focus on rebuilding without constantly worrying about how he was going to survive the next day. By the time a month had passed, John had secured a part-time job at the construction company, working on site with a team of veterans. The work wasn't easy, and there were days when his body ached, but it was honest work. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had purpose. The next milestone came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as John was walking back to his apartment, he saw a familiar face sitting on the steps. It was Ben. His son. For a moment, John froze. The sight of Ben, taller now, his face marked with the years that had passed, left him breathless. He wasn't sure how to approach, what to say, or even what to do. But Ben stood up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I figured I'd find you here," Ben said softly, his voice full of uncertainty. John swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ben. I didn't know if I'd ever see you again." "I came to see you," Ben replied, his voice steadier than John expected. I heard about what you're doing. I'm proud of you, Dad." The weight of his son's words hit John like a ton of bricks. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. "I'm not the man I used to be," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm trying, Ben. I'm really trying." Ben nodded slowly. "I can see that, Dad. I can see that." And in that moment, John realized something. The road ahead wasn't just about rebuilding himself. It was about rebuilding his relationships, his family. It was going to take time. But it had already begun. The weeks that followed were filled with a mixture of hope and tension. John had taken tentative steps forward, but he still felt the pull of his past, like invisible chains wrapped around him. Every time he thought about the future, there was a flicker of anxiety. He had a job now, which was a victory in itself, but the road ahead was anything but smooth. His relationship with Ben remained fragile. While their reunion was a step in the right direction, they were still strangers to each other in many ways. Ben had grown up without him, and John had missed so much of his son's life. There were awkward silences when they spoke, and even though Ben had made it clear that he was proud of his father for making an effort, there was still an emotional distance between them that John wasn't sure how to bridge. Work at the construction site kept John busy. Every day, he woke up early, donned his work boots, and joined the crew of veterans and other laborers to tackle physical tasks. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. The rhythm of manual labor helped him clear his mind, but it also wore him down. By the end of the day, his muscles were sore, his body exhausted, but his mind would always drift back to the same thought: was this really enough? Was this the life he wanted? Some days, when he looked at the other veterans on the crew, he saw the same uncertainty in their eyes. Some were older than him, others younger, but there was a shared understanding between them. They had all been through their own versions of hell, and now they were trying to rebuild their lives piece by piece. But the question always lingered: could any of them really escape their pasts? One evening, after a particularly grueling day, John sat on the porch of his small apartment, nursing a cold beer, and trying to find some peace. It was a rare moment of quiet, and he took it in. He'd never been one to slow down, never been the type to enjoy stillness. But now, it felt different. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than where he had been. As he sat there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps approaching broke his concentration. He turned to see a figure coming up the stairs: Ben. He had been visiting more often lately, but they hadn't talked much. John hadn't known what to say to him, and Ben hadn't seemed to know how to reach out. "Hey, Dad," Ben said, standing at the top of the stairs with his hands in his pockets. His voice was softer than usual. John nodded in acknowledgement, setting his beer down. "Hey, kid. What's up?" Ben hesitated for a moment before walking over and sitting beside his father. They sat in silence for a long while, both unsure of how to start the conversation. But finally, it was Ben who spoke first. "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes cast downward. "About us. You know, all these years I grew up without you, I thought you were just gone. Like you just disappeared from our lives." But now, I'm starting to understand that it wasn't just you disappearing. It was everything. It was life. I guess I'm just trying to figure out where I fit in now. John's heart clenched in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when they could finally begin to heal the wounds of the past. But even as he reached for the right words, he struggled. I know I wasn't there for you, Ben, John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I can't change that. I wish I could have been the dad you needed. But I'm here now. I know that doesn't fix everything, but I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I want to try. Ben nodded slowly. I know you're trying, Dad. I can see that. It's just hard. You weren't there for so long. I guess I've built a life without you in it, and I don't know how to bring you into it. And I don't know if I can trust you again. John felt the sting of his son's words, but they weren't the words of anger, just the words of someone who had been hurt too many times. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't suffocating. John took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I understand, Ben, he said. I really do. And I don't expect everything to be okay overnight. But I'll be here. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. And if you don't know how to trust me again, that's okay. I'm not going anywhere. I'm working on myself. And I'll keep working, for both of us. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope between them. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it certainly wasn't a magical fix, but it was something. It was a start. Ben wasn't ready to forgive him entirely, not yet, but he was beginning to see that his father was making an effort. And that was all John could ask for. The next day, at work, John found himself thinking a lot about what had happened with Ben. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding back until now. The weight of his past was always there, hovering in the background, but something had shifted in him. Maybe it was Ben's words. Maybe it was the sheer act of having this conversation, of acknowledging the pain they had both suffered. But whatever it was a reminder, change wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. That evening, after work, John received a call from his program coordinator, Maria. She had been following up with him regularly, keeping track of his progress and making sure that he was staying on course. Hey, John, Maria said cheerfully. How's everything going? Good, actually. Better than I expected, John replied, leaning back in his chair. I got the part-time job, and I'm starting to make some progress. I'm even starting to talk to Ben more. Maria's voice softened. That's great to hear, John. I'm proud of you. You know, when you first came into the program, you didn't seem so sure of yourself. But I can hear the change in your voice. It's real. John couldn't help but smile at her words. It feels real. I'm not where I want to be yet, but I'm on my way. Maria paused for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. John, I think you're ready for something more. We've got a full-time position available with one of our local partners, a construction firm that hires veterans. It's a great opportunity, and I think you'd be perfect for it. The offer hung in the air for a moment, and John felt the weight of the decision. It was a big step. A commitment. But he realized that if he wanted to keep moving forward, he had to keep pushing himself. He had to believe that he could do it. I'll take it, John said, his voice steady. Maria chuckled lightly. That's the spirit. I'll send you the details tomorrow. And just remember, John, the road ahead might still be tough, but you're not walking it alone. As John hung up the phone, he felt something that had eluded him for so long, pride. He was moving forward. He wasn't stuck in the past anymore. The journey was long, and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long while, he was confident that he could make it. The next few days were a whirlwind. John found himself both eager and nervous at the same time. The offer from the construction firm was a tangible sign of progress, a concrete opportunity that made him feel like he was finally stepping back into the world, not as a victim of his circumstances but as someone who could contribute, someone who had something to offer. He spent the weekend preparing, buying new work clothes, sharpening his resume, and making sure he was mentally ready for the challenge. He had been in a cycle of survival for so long that it was hard to imagine what it would be like to move past that. But he was determined to try. On Monday morning, John found himself standing outside the offices of the construction company. The building was nothing fancy, a simple, no-frills structure, like many in the industry. But to John, it represented more than just a job. It was a chance at stability, a chance at proving to himself that he could rebuild his life. His heart raced as he walked through the door, the smell of fresh paint and cement filling his nostrils. The receptionist greeted him with a smile and handed him a form to fill out. After filling out the necessary paperwork, John was escorted to the back office, where he was greeted by a man in his mid-40s, wearing a hard hat and a faded flannel shirt. "John, right?" the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Rick. I'll be overseeing your training here." John shook Rick's hand, feeling a little more at ease. "Yes, sir. I appreciate you giving me a chance." "No problem at all," Rick replied. "We're always looking for people with a strong work ethic. And from what I've heard, you've got that in spades." John nodded, trying to fight back the nervousness building in his chest. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not in the context of work. For years, his identity had been tied to his military service, to the battlefield. He had always been part of something bigger than himself, and now, for the first time, he was stepping into something different, something he had to carve out on his own. Rick gave him a tour of the facilities, explaining the safety procedures and the tools they would be working with. It was a lot to absorb, but John found himself listening intently, grateful for the structure and guidance. By the end of the day, his head was spinning, but he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had made it through his first day. Over the next few weeks, John threw himself into the work with everything he had. It was hard, grueling labor, but it was rewarding in its own way. There were no shortcuts here. He had to learn the ropes from the ground up, and that's exactly what he did. He worked alongside a team of skilled tradespeople, many of whom were veterans themselves. They spoke the same language, no pretenses, just raw, honest conversation. Slowly but surely, John started to earn their respect. His physical strength, honed from years in the military, served him well. He quickly picked up on the technical aspects of the job, and despite the occasional misstep, he felt himself growing more confident with each passing day. He was part of something again, something that mattered. He wasn't just working for a paycheck. He was building something that would last. The job also gave him the chance to spend more time with his colleagues, who became like a second family to him. There was Greg, a burly ex-Marine who had been with the company for years. He had a dry sense of humor and a no-nonsense attitude. Then there was Sarah, a former Army medic, who had a quiet strength about her. She always seemed to know what to say when the stress of the day got to be too much. And then there was Alex, a younger guy who had just joined the company a few months before John. He was still getting used to civilian life, but he was eager to learn. It was during one of their lunch breaks that Greg pulled John aside. "Hey, man," Greg said in his deep, gravelly voice. "You're doing great. The guys are impressed with how you've settled in. You've got the work ethic we like to see." John felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had always believed that hard work was the key to overcoming anything, and hearing it from someone like Greg, who had been through his own struggles, felt like validation. "Thanks, Greg," John said, his voice sincere. "It means a lot to hear that." Greg gave him a quick nod. "Listen, I know things have been tough for you. But you're not alone here. We've all got our demons, you know. Some of us just hide them better than others." John looked at Greg, grateful for the candidness. "I've got a long way to go," he admitted. "But I'm trying. I really am. Keep trying, John." That's all any of us can do. As John continued to settle into his new life, he found himself thinking more and more about Ben. Their last conversation had been a turning point, but he knew that it would take more than a few awkward attempts at reconciliation to rebuild the trust between them. Ben had a lot of unanswered questions, and John had no illusions about how difficult it would be to repair the damage of the years they had spent apart. But he was committed. He had to be. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, John was at home when he received a call from Ben. His heart raced a little in his chest. Was this it? Was Ben going to say something that would make him feel like all his efforts were in vain? "Hey, Dad," Ben said, his voice cautious but warm. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I'm not ready to jump back into everything, but I'd like to see you again. Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime." John's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of hope. "I'd like that, Ben," he said, his voice steady. "I'd really like that." They made plans to meet the following weekend, and for the first time in a long time, John felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. It was fragile, but it was there. As the weeks passed, John continued to work hard, and he continued to rebuild his relationship with Ben, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, John believed that the future might just hold something worth fighting for. The weekend meeting with Ben was everything John had hoped for and more. For the first time in years, he was sitting across from his son at a small cafe, not as a stranger but as someone who was making an effort, someone who genuinely wanted to be part of his son's life again. They had exchanged pleasantries, and there had been a lot of small talk, awkward at first, but necessary to break the ice. "So, how's work?" Ben asked, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. John took a deep breath, savoring the moment. "It's good. Really good. Hard work, but I'm getting the hang of it. They've been really patient with me. I'm starting to feel like I'm actually contributing again." Ben raised an eyebrow. "That's great, Dad." "Really?" For a moment, there was silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. John could feel the weight of the years they had spent apart, and he could see that Ben was still carrying the emotional scars from that time. But the fact that they were sitting there together, having a conversation at all, meant something. It meant that, despite everything, they were both willing to try. "I'm glad to hear that," Ben finally said. "You know, when I first found out you were back in town, I wasn't sure what to think. I didn't know if you were just gonna disappear again, like you did before. But, you seem different now." John swallowed hard. He had expected Ben to say something like that, but hearing it aloud still stung. He had been gone for so long, and the damage was done. There was no way to undo the hurt, no way to make up for all the lost time. All he could do now was prove himself through actions, not words. "I know I can't make up for what I've missed, Ben," John said, his voice quiet but steady. "I just want you to know that I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I want to build something with you again, even if it takes time." Ben's eyes softened, and for a moment, John saw a flicker of the young boy he had once known, before the years had hardened him. But it was still raw, still fragile. "I'm not expecting you to fix everything overnight, Dad," Ben said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But I appreciate that you're trying. That's more than I could have asked for." They talked for another hour, covering everything from Ben's college plans to John's new job. It wasn't an earth-shattering conversation, but it was enough. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, they were on the road to healing. As they parted ways that afternoon, Ben gave John a hug, something that caught him by surprise. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was enough to remind John that there was still hope, still the possibility of reconnection. But that night, as John lay in bed, his mind raced. He had done something good today, yes. He had made progress. But there was still so much more to do. There were still so many walls to break down, so many wounds to heal. His relationship with Ben was still fragile, and he had to tread carefully. But at least now, it felt like they had the possibility of something real. The next morning, John woke up early, as he always did. The sun was barely rising, and he was already out the door and on his way to work. The cold morning air hit him as he walked toward his truck, and he found himself reflecting on the changes in his life. The job, the steps toward rebuilding his relationship with Ben, the small victories that were starting to add up. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was his life, and he was fighting for it. When he arrived at the construction site, Rick was waiting for him, clipboard in hand. "Morning, John," Rick called as John approached. "We've got a big project today. Gonna need everyone on their toes. It's gonna be a test of everyone's skills, and I'm counting on you to lead the crew." John's heart skipped a beat. Leading the crew? He had never been in a leadership role before, at least not in this capacity. It was one thing to follow orders, it was another thing entirely to be the one giving them. "I'm ready, Rick," John said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling in his stomach. "I've got this." Rick gave him a nod of approval. "That's what I like to hear. Let's get to work." As the day wore on, John found himself in the thick of it, overseeing a variety of tasks, coordinating the team, ensuring that safety protocols were being followed, and troubleshooting any issues that came up. It wasn't easy, but he was surprised by how much he enjoyed it. For the first time in a long time, he felt useful. He felt like he was contributing to something bigger than himself. By the end of the day, as the sun set and the crew packed up for the night, Rick pulled John aside. "You did well today," Rick said. "I know you're still getting your feet under you, but I've seen a lot of potential in you. You've got the leadership qualities, just trust yourself a little more. You've earned the respect of the crew." John smiled, though there was a hint of disbelief in his eyes. "Thanks, Rick. That means a lot." Rick clapped him on the back. "You've got this, John. Keep pushing forward." As John made his way home that evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He was doing it. It was hard work, and there were still so many obstacles to overcome, but he was making it happen. And it wasn't just the job, he was rebuilding his life, step by step. That night, as he sat down to a quiet dinner by himself, John picked up his phone and sent Ben a text. "I'm proud of you, son. Thanks for giving me a chance. Let's keep working on this, one step at a time." He didn't expect an immediate response. It wasn't about that. It was about laying the foundation for something that could last. As John finished his meal, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of satisfaction. Things were still far from perfect, but they were moving in the right direction. And for the first time in a long while, John felt like he was in control. He was no longer defined by his past. He was building a future, one that, with hard work and perseverance, could be filled with possibility. The sound of his alarm pulling him from a restless sleep was a harsh reminder that every day still brought its own challenges. John had woken up multiple times during the night, his mind racing with thoughts of what he still hadn't accomplished. He had come a long way, yes, but the scars of his past were not something that disappeared overnight. The loss of his military career, his broken relationship with Ben, the years spent wandering without purpose, all of these things were still with him, hanging in the background like shadows that he couldn't shake. He forced himself out of bed, each movement feeling a little heavier than the last. The same routine. Wake up, get dressed, make the drive to work. But today was different. Today, he had a responsibility that stretched beyond himself. He was leading the crew on an important project, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him. Rick had been clear, this job was crucial, and he needed to prove that he could handle it. It wasn't just about getting the work done, it was about showing the team, and himself, that he could still be the man he once was. As John walked to his truck, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Ben. "I've been thinking about what you said. I'm glad you're trying. Let's meet again next week. How about Tuesday? John paused, staring at the screen for a moment, unsure of what to say. Things between him and Ben were still fragile. Every word they exchanged felt loaded with unspoken meaning, and John didn't want to say the wrong thing. He had hurt his son so much already. He quickly typed out a response. I'd like that. Tuesday sounds good. I'll make sure I'm there. As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, a small sense of hope flickered inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. But even as that thought crossed his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would be just as rocky as the one behind him. At work, the day felt longer than usual. The project they were working on was complex, requiring everyone to be on their toes. It involved the construction of a new office building, a task that required precision, attention to detail, and teamwork. The pressure was mounting, and John could feel it. There were times when it felt like everything was on the verge of falling apart. The crew had questions, and the deadline loomed large. But John pushed through, focusing on the task at hand. Rick had made it clear that John needed to show leadership, and he was doing his best. He coordinated the team, made sure everyone knew their roles, and kept the job moving forward. It wasn't easy, but John had always been a quick learner. He adapted, used his military training to stay focused, and kept pushing the team to do their best. By mid-afternoon, things started to fall into place. The construction site, once chaotic and disorganized, started to take shape. The workers were moving with purpose, and for the first time all day, John felt like he was in control. His confidence was building, and he felt that familiar rush, the one he had missed during his years of struggle, when he had been lost and adrift. This was what it felt like to lead again. As the day wound down, John found himself walking around the site, inspecting the work that had been done. The crew was finishing up, preparing to call it a day, when he saw Greg standing by a set of scaffolding, looking at a set of blueprints. "Everything good?" John asked, approaching him. Greg glanced up, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're not half bad at this whole leadership thing, John. We're ahead of schedule, and I think we might even finish this project a little early if we keep this up." John's heart swelled with pride. This was the kind of recognition he had been craving. It wasn't the grand gestures or the praise he used to get when he was in the military, but it was enough. It was real. "Thanks, Greg," John said. "It's been a team effort. Couldn't have done it without everyone here." Greg nodded. "Yeah, well, you're doing something right. I'll give you that. Just keep that focus, and you'll be running this site in no time." John chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through him. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to find his footing again. That night, after another long day, John sat down on his worn-out couch, trying to unwind. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, the successes, the challenges, the moments when he had questioned himself. There were still so many things to work through, so many ways in which his past was affecting his present. But for the first time in a long while, John didn't feel quite so overwhelmed. He had taken another step forward, and that was something to be proud of. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from the construction company. He had just completed his first month on the job, and they wanted to meet with him the next morning to discuss his progress. John felt a knot form in his stomach. Was this going to be another test? Another hurdle to jump over? He took a deep breath and put the phone down. No matter what happened in that meeting tomorrow, he knew he had made it this far. And that was something. He was still here, still fighting. That meant everything. The next morning, John arrived at the office feeling a bit more tense than usual. The meeting wasn't scheduled until later in the day, so he spent the morning preparing, making sure he had all the details of the project at hand, reviewing the crew's progress, and preparing for whatever feedback might come his way. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting time, his mind wandered. His thoughts went back to Ben. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and the hope he had felt was starting to slip away again. He wanted so badly to repair his relationship with his son, but he wasn't sure how to keep making progress. Every step forward felt like it was followed by 2 steps back. Still, he couldn't afford to focus on that now. He had a job to do. His future, his new life, depended on him staying grounded and focused. When the meeting finally came, John walked into the conference room, bracing himself for what was to come. Rick and a few other senior staff members were already there, waiting for him. The atmosphere was professional, but John could feel the tension in the air. Was this the moment when everything would change? Rick stood up as John entered, offering a firm handshake. "John," Rick said, "we've been impressed with your work over the past month. You've really stepped up, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. We'd like to offer you a permanent position on the team. How does that sound?" John's heart skipped a beat. A permanent position. This was it. This was the moment that could set the course for everything to come. I'm honored," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." Rick smiled. "I know you won't." For the first time in a long time, John allowed himself to feel the weight of accomplishment, a weight that felt much lighter than the one he had been carrying for years. He had done it. The road ahead was still long, but he had earned his place in the world again. As he walked out of the meeting, John realized something that he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before: he was beginning to rebuild his life. One step at a time. John's phone buzzed as he sat in his truck, the engine idling and the city slowly coming to life outside the window. It was a text from Ben. "I've been thinking. How about we take this slow? Maybe go out for a walk, talk more, get to know each other again. It doesn't have to be anything big." John stared at the screen, a rush of emotion flooding over him. For so long, he had felt like an outsider in Ben's life, unsure if his son even wanted him around. This simple text was more than just an invitation to meet. It was a lifeline, an opening that John wasn't sure he was ready for but couldn't refuse. He quickly typed back. "I'd really like that. I'm free this weekend. Let's do it." John took a deep breath and put his phone down. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Ben was willing to meet him halfway. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for their relationship after all. The day passed in a blur of work and routine. John had a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. With the offer for a permanent position, he was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. The project they were working on was progressing ahead of schedule, and John was starting to feel more and more comfortable in his role as a leader. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, there were always setbacks, always new challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control over his future. By the time the workday ended, John felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The tension that had built up over the last few months seemed to dissipate as he packed up his things and prepared to head home. He couldn't shake the thought of the walk with Ben. It felt like the beginning of something. Something that would require patience, vulnerability, and a willingness to face the past. But as he drove home, the questions crept back into his mind. What if Ben still couldn't forgive him? What if the damage was too deep? These were the thoughts that had plagued him for years, the ones that had kept him at arm's length from his son. But now, with this small gesture, there was a chance. A chance to start again. The weekend came quickly, and John found himself standing in front of the coffee shop, the one he and Ben had visited that first time. It was a small, cozy place, nothing fancy, but it felt familiar. It felt like a good starting point. John's phone buzzed. A message from Ben. "I'm here. Just waiting outside. You ready?" John smiled and replied. "On my way." As he walked toward the door, his nerves returned. It had been a long time since he had tried to connect with Ben, and there was so much left unsaid between them. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that this was the moment to take a step toward healing. When he stepped outside, Ben was sitting on a bench, looking up at the sky. He was dressed casually, in a hoodie and jeans, but there was something about the way he sat, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze distant, that made John's heart ache. Ben had grown up so much in the years they'd been apart, but there was still that familiar vulnerability in his eyes. John took a deep breath and walked toward him. "Hey, Ben," he said softly, trying to sound casual, though his voice trembled a little. Ben looked up and smiled, though it was a small smile, as though he wasn't quite sure how to react either. "Hey, Dad." They stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. It felt like everything had changed, and yet nothing had. The years of silence hung between them, and John wasn't sure how to break it. Ben shifted on the bench, patting the spot next to him. "You want to sit?" John nodded and sat down. The cool spring breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though they were both gathering the strength to dive into what needed to be said. Finally, Ben spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About trying. I don't know how we're supposed to just pick up where we left off. But I guess I'm willing to try too." John's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't the grand reconciliation he had imagined, but it was more than he could have hoped for. "I don't want to rush anything, Ben. I'm just grateful that you're willing to give me another chance." Ben looked away for a moment, his eyes focused on the ground. When he looked back at John, there was a vulnerability there that John hadn't expected. "I'm not gonna lie, it's been hard. I spent a lot of years wondering if you'd ever come back. And when you did, I didn't know what to think. But I guess I've always wanted you around, Dad. Even if I didn't say it." John felt a lump form in his throat. His son, his own flesh and blood, had carried the weight of his absence all these years. And now, after everything, he was sitting here, willing to open up. John reached out and placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me, and I can't change that. But I want you to know, I'm here now. And I want to be part of your life. Not just as your dad, but as someone who can be there for you, no matter what." Ben nodded, a small smile creeping across his face. "I think I can handle that." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the past slowly starting to lift. The tension that had built up between them for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by something more hopeful. A chance to rebuild. After a while, Ben stood up and stretched. "How about we go for that walk?" John stood with him, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I'd like that." As they walked together down the quiet street, the conversation drifted to lighter topics: Ben's college plans, John's new job, the small victories that had been won. But there was an unspoken understanding between them now. The walk wasn't just about passing time, it was about taking steps, together, toward healing. By the time the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the city, John realized that, in a way, this was the beginning of something new. It wasn't perfect, and there would still be challenges ahead. But it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weeks that followed that afternoon with Ben felt like a slow but steady climb, like a mountain that was tall but surmountable. John's life had been a series of hard, uphill struggles. Each step forward was earned, but the weight of the past never truly left him. Yet, for the first time in what felt like years, there was a glimpse of something different in his life. He wasn't just fighting against the current anymore. He was swimming with it. He continued to work hard at the construction site. Each day was a new challenge, but John had a renewed sense of purpose. His team respected him more than he had ever anticipated, and the project they were working on was going smoothly. He could feel himself growing into his role, and for once, it didn't feel like he was just holding on, it felt like he was actually contributing. But it wasn't just work that had begun to shift. His relationship with Ben was blossoming, slowly but surely. Their walks together became more frequent. They talked about everything from the mundane to the deeply personal, sharing moments of honesty that John had thought might never come again. It was like learning to speak the same language after years of silence. They both knew it would take time, but this, the connection they were building, felt like the first true step toward redemption for John. Yet, even in the midst of these small victories, doubt crept in like a shadow at the edges of his mind. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the job site, John sat in his truck outside his small apartment, staring at the messages on his phone. There was one message from Rick, the project manager, that stood out. "John, I've been hearing great things about your work lately. How about we sit down tomorrow and discuss some potential leadership opportunities? I think you've got real potential." The message felt like a lifeline, a tangible sign that all his hard work was paying off. But at the same time, it was a reminder of how far he had to go. Leadership opportunities meant more responsibility, more pressure, more of the person he used to be before the fall. Could he really take on more? Was he ready to fully step into that role? John rubbed his temples, trying to clear the fog in his mind. The doubt was always there, lingering. But it wasn't just about work. It was about everything: the relationship with Ben, the self-doubt, the memories of who he used to be and who he was becoming. As he thought about the possibilities of his future, he thought back to the night he'd spent alone in the shelter, the lowest point of his life. He had been nothing then. Just a man in a broken suit, barely keeping it together. But now, he wasn't that person anymore. He had built himself back up, slowly and methodically, brick by brick. And if he could do that, if he could change that much, why couldn't he continue to change? The next day, John arrived at work a little earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty site. There was something calming about this time of day, before the world rushed in with its demands, before the pressure mounted. John liked to take a few quiet moments to himself before the noise began. As he walked across the lot toward the trailer that served as the office, he noticed a few of the guys already hard at work, setting up equipment and getting ready for the day. He nodded at them, acknowledging their efforts, feeling a quiet pride that he was leading these men, guiding them towards something bigger than just another project. Inside the trailer, Rick was already sitting at the desk, reviewing some papers. He looked up as John entered. "Morning, John," Rick said with a smile. "Glad you could make it." "Morning," John replied, settling into the chair across from him. "What's up?" Rick leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I've been watching you work. And I think it's time we talked about the next step for you. You've proven yourself on this project. You've got the skills. But now it's about taking on more responsibility, more leadership." John nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment. He'd worked for this. "I'm ready," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, the doubt crept in. Was he truly ready? Was he prepared for the weight of more responsibility? Rick studied him for a moment, as if weighing his response. "I think you are. But let's talk about what that means. If you're going to take on more, you need to be prepared to make decisions that affect more than just the job. You're going to be looking out for the welfare of the entire crew, managing the pressure that comes with deadlines, keeping morale up when things go wrong. It's not just about getting the work done. It's about being the kind of leader people trust." John felt a knot form in his stomach. It was a lot. A lot more than he had bargained for. But then he thought about the day he'd stood on the street corner, homeless and hopeless. And how far he'd come since then. He couldn't go backward. "I'm ready," he repeated. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I've been through worse. I can handle it." Rick nodded. "Good. We'll start you out slow, but we'll see how you handle things. I have no doubt you'll do well." The days that followed were a whirlwind. John threw himself into his new role with everything he had. He found himself juggling multiple tasks at once, overseeing the crew's progress, making decisions on the fly, and ensuring that everyone stayed on track. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive, like he was exactly where he was meant to be. But there were moments of doubt, too. Moments when things went wrong, when mistakes were made, when he questioned his ability to lead. It was in those moments that he leaned into the lessons he had learned during the darkest days of his life. He had learned to adapt, to keep moving forward, even when the world felt like it was crumbling around him. He couldn't afford to stop now. And through it all, there was Ben. Their walks continued, their conversations deepened, and slowly but surely, the bond between father and son grew stronger. Ben had been tentative at first, unsure of how to navigate the emotional landscape of their relationship. But John could see the changes in his son, too. Ben was starting to trust again, starting to believe that maybe his father wasn't the man he used to be. John knew it wasn't going to be easy. But he also knew that, together, they could heal. Slowly. Piece by piece. One evening, after a long day, John and Ben sat together on the porch of John's apartment. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold as the sun set behind the city. John looked over at his son. "You know, I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd be able to fix things with you. But here we are. And I'm grateful." Ben smiled softly, a glimmer of something that resembled hope in his eyes. "Me too, Dad. Me too." And in that moment, John realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. Redemption wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, every day, and trying. It was about the small victories that added up over time. And most importantly, it was about being there for the people who mattered most. As John sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him, his mind was racing. The weeks of progress with Ben, the newfound sense of responsibility at work, it was all good. But there was something more waiting for him, something that would test not just his resolve, but his very character. Rick had asked him to take on a big responsibility. More than he had ever expected. With the project nearing its final phase, it was clear the company was looking at John as a serious contender for a management position, one that would not only impact the team but could change his life in ways he wasn't fully prepared for. As the days passed, the pressure of that responsibility began to settle in. John found himself staying up late at night, running through plans, reviewing the team's performance, and second-guessing himself. He had never been someone to back down from a challenge, but the weight of leadership was different. He wasn't just managing construction schedules anymore, he was managing people's lives. Their livelihoods. Their trust. It was a daunting realization, one that left John unsure of whether he was ready. Every mistake he made, no matter how small, felt like a reflection of his past failures. He couldn't afford to let down the team. He couldn't afford to let down Ben. The first test came earlier than expected. One afternoon, while overseeing a section of the project, one of the younger workers, Matt, made a costly error. It was a simple mistake, really. He had misread the measurements for a foundation wall, which would delay the project by at least a day, if not more. The cost of that mistake wasn't just financial, it could potentially ruin the tight timeline they had set for the completion. John could feel the tension building as he approached Matt, who was nervously fiddling with his tools, avoiding eye contact. The rest of the crew stood off to the side, waiting for John's response. It wasn't just the error that weighed on John, it was the fact that this was his moment to lead. How he handled this would set the tone for his leadership. He had two choices: he could explode, call Matt out in front of the team, and assert his authority in the hopes of getting respect. Or, he could handle the situation with calm, understanding, and wisdom, showing his team that mistakes are part of the process, and that learning from them was more important than punishing them. John exhaled slowly, trying to keep his emotions in check. He walked over to Matt, who still hadn't looked up. "Matt," John said softly but firmly, look at me." The young man hesitated but slowly raised his eyes. His face was flushed, his anxiety clear. John placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them. I need you to go back, double-check your work, and figure out a solution. If you need help, ask. Don't be afraid to ask." The relief on Matt's face was immediate. He nodded quickly, mumbling an apology before scurrying off to correct his mistake. John turned to the rest of the team, his voice steady and calm. "We're all in this together. We make mistakes, but we fix them as a team. Keep an eye on the work and help each other out. We're all responsible for this, and we're all accountable." The crew nodded, and for the first time, John felt the weight of his leadership shift in a positive direction. His decision to handle the situation with empathy had earned him their respect, not through power, but through understanding. Later that evening, John received a text from Rick. "I heard about what happened with Matt. I just want to say, that's the kind of leadership I'm talking about. Keep it up. The promotion is yours if you want it." John stared at the screen, his heart pounding. It was the validation he had been waiting for, but the words felt different now. They weren't just about the job anymore, they were about the man he had become. He wasn't just leading a project, he was leading people. He was becoming someone who could be counted on, not just at work, but in life. But with that realization came another. The responsibility was much bigger than he had ever imagined. The next weekend, John met Ben again for their usual walk. This time, there was a quiet anticipation between them. They had been talking more and more about their lives, and John was starting to understand the depth of the emotional gap that still existed between them. There were things left unsaid, things that only time and patience could heal. They walked through the park, the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves above them. Ben had mentioned wanting to talk about something important, and John had been anxious all week. What if this was it? What if Ben had finally decided that he couldn't forgive him? What if their progress had been just an illusion? Ben finally broke the silence. "Dad, I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet. "About us. About everything. And I'm not sure where we go from here." John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Ben paused, kicking a small stone down the path. "I mean, I'm trying. I really am. But sometimes it feels like I'm still holding on to everything you've done. Everything you didn't do. And I know you're trying, too. But I guess I'm just not sure if I can keep moving forward." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain. John stopped walking and turned to face his son. He knew that this moment was different. This wasn't about work, or the past, or anything they had talked about before. This was about trust. About forgiveness. "I know it's been hard, Ben. I can't change what happened, and I can't take back the time we lost. But what I can do is keep showing up. I can keep proving to you that I'm not the man I was back then. I can't make you forgive me, but I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Ben looked at his father, his eyes searching, unsure. "I don't know if I can just forget everything. But I guess I'm willing to try." John smiled softly, feeling a weight lift off his chest. "That's all I can ask for." As they continued walking, the world around them felt a little less heavy. There was no immediate fix, no sudden resolution, but there was a sense of movement, of progress, even if it was slow. John knew that their relationship would take time, but he had learned something valuable over the years: healing wasn't a straight line. It had its ups and downs, its twists and turns. But as long as they were both trying, they were on the right path. And maybe that was enough. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of John's apartment, casting soft stripes of light across the floor. It had been several weeks since that pivotal moment with Ben, where their relationship had started to show signs of real healing. John still couldn't shake the sense that something monumental was approaching. He wasn't sure what it was, whether it was another challenge or a breakthrough, but he could feel the pressure building up inside him. He had been working hard at the construction site, leading his team with an increasingly steady hand. The work had been progressing smoothly, but John could feel the weight of leadership growing heavier with each passing day. He wasn't just managing tasks anymore, he was managing people's lives, their livelihoods, and their trust. It was a lot of responsibility, and some days it felt like he was walking on a tightrope, afraid of falling. Despite the growing tension, there was a sense of calm about John that hadn't been there before. He was learning to trust in himself. He knew that mistakes would happen, and he was finally beginning to accept that imperfection was part of the process. But just as he was starting to feel settled, life threw him a curveball. It happened one Tuesday afternoon, during a routine lunch break at the job site. John was standing with a few of his crew members when a car pulled up near the site, the screech of tires against the gravel echoing in the quiet air. John glanced up, instinctively squinting at the unfamiliar vehicle. Out stepped a man in a dark suit, his posture rigid and confident. The man's presence was almost palpable, a person who commanded attention without saying a word. His eyes swept the construction site as he walked toward the group, and when they met John's gaze, he gave a subtle nod. John's heart skipped. The man's face seemed oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Excuse me," the man's voice rang out, sharp and professional. "Is this the site where John Crawford works?" John hesitated, his breath catching. Crawford. That was his name. But who was this man? "I'm John Crawford," he said, walking toward the stranger, trying to maintain a calm exterior. The man's eyes narrowed slightly before his lips curved into a tight smile. "I thought that might be you. You don't remember me, do you?" John's mind raced, trying to place the face, but it was like looking at a foggy memory. Then, it hit him like a ton of bricks. This man was someone from his past, someone he hadn't seen in over a decade. Rick? Rick Thompson. John stammered, the recognition finally dawning. Rick Thompson. An old acquaintance from John's early days in the workforce. They had worked together at a different construction firm years ago. Back then, Rick had been a rising star in the industry, someone everyone looked up to. But the last time John saw him, Rick had been promoted to a position far above his own, and they'd lost touch after John's personal life had spiraled out of control. The surprise of seeing Rick now was overwhelming. What was he doing here? And why now? Rick's smile widened slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I see you're doing well for yourself, John. I didn't expect to find you in a place like this." John didn't respond immediately. He was still trying to process the situation. The presence of Rick brought a rush of memories he hadn't dealt with in years. Back then, Rick had been a mentor to John, someone who had given him advice, guidance, and sometimes, tough love. He had pushed John to work harder, to rise above his circumstances. But John had lost himself in the chaos of his life, and they drifted apart. "What brings you here, Rick?" John finally asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Rick glanced around the site, his eyes scanning the workers as they carried on with their tasks. "Well, I've been hearing some things about you, John. Your reputation's changed quite a bit since the last time we spoke. I hear you're stepping up in the world. I've got a proposition for you." John frowned, sensing that Rick's words were loaded with more than just a friendly visit. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a certain coolness in Rick's demeanor, a sharp edge that John hadn't remembered. "What kind of proposition?" John asked, narrowing his eyes. He wasn't sure he liked where this conversation was going. Rick's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. But then, he spoke, his voice laced with an almost condescending charm. "We're starting a new project, John. A big one. Bigger than anything you've worked on. And we need someone with your experience." Rick's eyes held John's, as if trying to read him. "I've always believed in your potential, and I think it's time you had the chance to prove it again." This could be your ticket back to the top, John. The kind of success you used to have before everything happened. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The mention of the bold success brought back memories he had tried to bury, the greed, the pressure, the choices that had led him to lose everything. Rick was offering him a chance to return to that world, a world of high stakes and ambition. But was it a world he wanted to return to? He stared at Rick, the weight of the decision settling heavily in his chest. "I'm not sure I'm the same person I was back then, Rick," John said quietly, his voice firm. "I've worked hard to get where I am now. I've built a life for myself, one that I can be proud of. I don't think I can go back to that." Rick's eyes flickered, a brief flash of disappointment crossing his features. "I get it," he said, his tone turning colder. "You think you found something better. But believe me, John, people like you don't stay where you are forever. You'll always crave more." John's stomach twisted. He didn't like the sound of Rick's words. They felt manipulative, like the kind of pressure that had led him down dangerous paths in the past. "I'm not interested in going back," John said firmly, shaking his head. "I've got a life here now. I'm building something different." Rick paused, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving John standing there, alone with his thoughts. That night, as John sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the encounter with Rick lingered. He knew the offer wasn't just about business, it was about the past, and about proving something to himself that he didn't need to prove anymore. He had already learned the hard way that ambition without purpose led to destruction. John glanced at his phone, seeing a message from Ben. "Hey, Dad. You good?" John smiled, the warmth of his son's message bringing him a sense of peace. He didn't need the old world Rick was offering. He had everything he needed right here, his work, his team, and, most importantly, his family. With that thought, John took a deep breath, his resolve strengthening. The path ahead might be uncertain, but he was no longer afraid to walk it. The following weeks were a blur of work, personal growth, and reflection. John had resolved to move forward, embracing the life he was building, despite the temptation of the old world Rick had offered him. He had no desire to revisit that path. The idea of returning to a life of high stakes and the dangerous game of ambition was something he could no longer stomach. He had worked too hard to get to where he was now. He wasn't going to let it slip away. Yet, despite his resolve, the shadow of that offer lingered in the back of his mind. Every time he walked through the job site, he found himself wondering what might have been if he had taken the chance Rick had presented. The thought was fleeting, but still, it was there, whispering at the edges of his consciousness. It was a Thursday afternoon when John received another surprise visitor. Ben had been more distant lately, a mixture of busyness and the lingering unease that still existed between them. Though they were slowly working through their differences, there was still a barrier between father and son, a gap that wasn't so easily bridged. But John had noticed something. Lately, Ben had seemed more reflective. There was a quiet weight in his presence, as if he were contemplating something important. John was at the construction site, overseeing the final stages of a new project. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Ben. "Can we talk? I need your advice on something." John felt a flicker of hope in his chest. For weeks, their interactions had been pleasant, but somewhat distant, cordial without being personal. Ben was usually the one to keep the conversation light, never letting anything too serious slip through. But this text was different. This was Ben reaching out. He was asking for his father's advice. It was small, but it felt like a breakthrough. Without hesitation, John texted back, "Of course. Come by the site after work." Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, John stood outside, leaning against a pile of materials as he waited for Ben to arrive. The site was quieter now, with most of the crew gone for the day. There was a calm in the air, a peace that John hadn't felt in years. He was thinking about the future, about the decisions that lay ahead. His own life felt like it was on the cusp of something new, something better. He had finally managed to find a balance between work and his personal life. His job was going well, his relationship with his crew was stronger than ever, and his bond with Ben was slowly healing. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress, John had learned, was the key. When Ben arrived, he looked different. His posture was more confident, his eyes focused, but there was still something uncertain about him. Something he wasn't ready to share. John gestured to the bench on the outskirts of the site, where they often sat to talk. "Come on, have a seat." "What's going on?" Ben sat down slowly, staring out at the empty construction site. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, Ben spoke. His voice was soft but steady. "Dad, I've been thinking about my future. About what I want to do with my life. And I know I haven't always been the easiest to deal with, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do next." John listened carefully, his heart heavy with the weight of his son's words. He could see the struggle in Ben's eyes. He was trying to make sense of everything. The past, the present, and the future all seemed to be colliding inside of him. "I'm not sure where I fit in. I see you doing well. I see how much you've changed, and I don't know if I can ever be like that," Ben continued, his voice tinged with a hint of insecurity. "You're making a life for yourself, and I feel like I'm just stuck." John's heart tightened at the raw vulnerability in Ben's words. He had always known that his son had potential, but the pain in his voice made it clear that Ben was struggling to find his own way. "You don't have to be like me, Ben," John said gently, leaning forward. "You don't have to follow my path or anyone else's. You need to find your own. And that's okay if you're not sure where to start." Ben looked at his father, searching his face for some kind of answer. "But how do I do that? How do I figure out what I'm supposed to do?" John took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he could truly help his son, not with answers, but with guidance. "Ben, life isn't about finding the right path immediately," John said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's about exploring, making mistakes, and learning along the way. You won't have all the answers right now, and that's okay. But I promise you, as long as you keep moving forward, keep trying, you'll find your way." Ben nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his eyes. John reached out and put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort that spoke louder than any words could. "You've got time, Ben. And whatever you choose to do, I'll be here. You're not alone in this. You never were." There was a long silence after that, the kind of silence that seemed to hold all the unspoken thoughts between father and son. For the first time in a long while, John felt like he had given Ben something real, something more than advice, more than words. He had given him his presence, his support, his understanding. And that, for now, was enough. As they walked back to their cars, the night settling around them, John felt a new sense of peace. The path ahead for both of them was uncertain, but the important thing was that they were walking it together. As Ben drove off into the night, John stayed for a moment longer, watching the site that had become so much more than just a job for him. It had become a symbol of his new life, a life he was rebuilding, one small brick at a time. The future, John realized, wasn't something that would just appear in front of him. It was something he had to create, one decision, one moment, one conversation at a time. And he was ready for it. The sound of a phone buzzing startled John out of his thoughts, the vibration of it against the table breaking the stillness in the air. He had been sitting at his desk at home, going over some construction plans for the upcoming project, when the noise had pulled him from his work. Looking at the screen, he saw a message from Ben. "Dad, can we talk? It's about the offer Rick gave you. I need your advice." The request felt unexpected. John's immediate reaction was a mixture of concern and curiosity. Ben had always been a bit hesitant about the people John used to work with, especially those from the high-powered world he'd left behind. Rick's offer had loomed large over their lives lately, a shadow that Ben seemed to sense. Despite all the progress John had made, the past was still there, lingering like a reminder. John didn't hesitate. He quickly typed back. "I'll be at the site in an hour. I'll be waiting for you." An hour later, John was back at the construction site, sitting in the same spot where he had spoken to Ben weeks ago. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the empty space, creating a sense of quiet contemplation. It was an unusual time for a visit, but John understood. Sometimes, conversations that needed to happen couldn't wait for the right moment. And Ben had been carrying something heavy, something John knew had to be addressed. When Ben arrived, he seemed quieter than usual. He was dressed casually, his face still marked with the hint of uncertainty. John stood up as Ben approached, offering him a seat beside him. "Hey, Ben. What's on your mind?" Ben sat down, his eyes avoiding his father's gaze for a moment. He fiddled with the sleeve of his jacket, a nervous habit that John had seen all too often. "I don't know how to start," Ben said, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about that offer Rick gave you. And I don't know. It's just been bothering me, you know." John nodded, understanding immediately. The offer Rick had presented wasn't just a business proposal. It was a test of John's values, of his strength to stay on the path he had chosen. And now, Ben was feeling the weight of it too. "Yeah, it's been on my mind a lot too," John admitted, leaning back. "But I made a choice, Ben. And I want you to understand why." Ben looked up, his expression conflicted. "But don't you think there's a part of you that wonders what it would have been like if you'd taken that offer? I mean, you were really good at what you did before. You were successful. People respected you." John's heart tightened. He knew what Ben was trying to say. The pull of success, of returning to a familiar world where he had once been powerful, was strong. He could still feel it now, even as he fought to stay grounded. But that world had come at a cost, one he couldn't afford to pay again. "I was successful," John said slowly, his gaze steady on Ben. "But success isn't just about the title or the paycheck. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to get there. I lost myself in that world. I lost my integrity, my relationships, and most importantly, my peace of mind. The success I had came with a price I wasn't willing to pay again." Ben shifted in his seat, clearly torn. "But I just don't get it, Dad. You were on top. Why walk away from that?" John paused, gathering his thoughts. The question wasn't an easy one to answer. How could he explain the feeling of being trapped in a life where everything he had worked for felt hollow, unfulfilling? "I had everything, Ben. Money, power, recognition. But it wasn't real. It was all based on competition, on being better than everyone else, on living a life that wasn't true to who I was. It was exhausting. And in the end, it didn't bring me happiness. I thought I had to be a certain kind of person to be successful, but what I realized was that the person I had to be was the one I am right now. The one who's learning, growing, and making things right." Ben didn't speak for a while, clearly processing his father's words. John could see the wheels turning in his son's head. He was beginning to understand, slowly but surely, the complexities of choices and the weight they carried. "But what if I don't know what I want yet? What if I get stuck in a place where I'm not happy, like you were?" Ben finally asked, his voice tinged with concern. John let out a long sigh, his mind wandering briefly to his own journey. "You won't get stuck, Ben. I promise. We all go through phases where we're unsure of what comes next. But you have to trust yourself. You don't need to have it all figured out right now. And if you don't like where you are, you change it. You take the lessons from where you've been and you use them to create something better." Ben nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders seeming to ease just a little. John could see that his son was still uncertain about his own future, but this conversation had planted a seed. The kind of seed that, with time, would grow into understanding. "I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing, you know," Ben said, his voice quieter now. John smiled softly, his gaze warm. "I know, Ben. We all do. And that's why I'm here, to help guide you, to help you figure it out. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. But you have to trust yourself first. The right thing will always find its way to you, even if you don't see it right away." Ben took a deep breath, the weight on his shoulders seeming to lift just a bit. He looked at John, a small but genuine smile forming on his face. "Thanks, Dad. I think I needed to hear that." John's heart swelled with pride. In that moment, he saw the flicker of hope in Ben's eyes, the same hope that had carried him through his own darkest moments. It was a sign that Ben was finding his way, one step at a time. As they stood up to leave the site, John placed a hand on Ben's shoulder, a simple but powerful gesture of connection. They might not have all the answers, but together, they were stronger. Later that evening, as John sat alone in his living room, he thought back on the conversation with Ben. It was a pivotal moment, one that would shape both of their futures in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Life was never as simple as right or wrong choices. It was about the courage to face uncertainty, to learn from mistakes, and to move forward with purpose. And as he sat in the quiet of his home, John knew one thing for certain: the choices they made now would define their futures. And whatever came next, he was ready for it. The following days felt like a roller coaster for John, each day bringing new challenges, decisions, and moments of self-reflection. The work on the construction site was progressing smoothly, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with Ben. He had offered his son guidance, a guiding light in a world that often felt uncertain. But deep inside, John knew that his own journey wasn't over yet. There were still things to reconcile within himself. Things he had pushed to the back of his mind for too long. One evening, as John was finishing up his work in the office, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call, a familiar number that immediately made his heart skip a beat. It was Rick. He hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what the conversation might bring. There was something unsettling about hearing Rick's voice after everything that had happened. "John, it's Rick. I've been thinking about our last conversation. And I wanted to ask you one last time, are you sure about walking away from everything we talked about? There's still time, you know. You could come back, make the right move. We could make this work, just like we always did." John felt a heavy sigh escape his lips. He had been expecting this. Rick was relentless, always a master at dangling the promise of something bigger, something better in front of him. It had worked before. How many times had John given in, chasing after success and recognition without ever stopping to ask if it was truly worth it? "I'm not going back, Rick," John replied firmly, his voice steady. "I've made my choice. I'm on a different path now, one that's about more than just success. It's about building something real. Something lasting." Rick didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched between them like an unspoken tension. Finally, Rick spoke, his tone colder than before. "You're making a mistake, John. I'm offering you something that could set you up for life. And you're turning it down. You think this new life is going to fulfill you? You think these little projects are going to bring you happiness? Trust me, you're better than that. You know it." John felt his pulse quicken as the old doubts began to creep in. The familiar pull of ambition, the allure of wealth, and the recognition that Rick was offering, it was tempting. So tempting. But John had been down that road before, and he couldn't let it consume him again. "No, Rick," John said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm choosing peace. I'm choosing integrity. I'm choosing my family. That's not a mistake." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Rick chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. Suit yourself, John. But don't come crawling back when it all falls apart. You'll regret this." John didn't respond. He simply hung up the phone and set it down on the desk, taking a deep breath. The conversation had left him feeling drained, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. And while it was difficult to let go of the person he once was, the person who had thrived in the fast-paced, cutthroat world Rick represented, he knew he was moving in the right direction. The next morning, John went back to the site, putting the conversation with Rick out of his mind. His crew was already hard at work, the usual hum of activity filling the air as they completed their tasks. John greeted them with his usual enthusiasm, ready to dive back into the work that had become his new focus. But as the day went on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the work, or the people, everything seemed to be running smoothly. But in the back of his mind, the weight of his conversation with Rick lingered. He wondered if he had made the right decision, if maybe he was missing something. The temptation to return to that world of power, status, and success was always just one call away. And while he knew he had chosen the right path, the uncertainty about the future made it hard to ignore the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was walking away from something big. That afternoon, as he stood overlooking the site, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Ben. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe I'm not ready to figure everything out right now. But I know one thing, I want to be involved in the business. I want to work with you. I think it's time I stop running away from things." John's heart swelled with pride as he read the message. He hadn't expected this, but it felt like a sign. Ben was taking the first step towards his own future, towards carving out a place for himself. He wasn't sure what that future looked like, but it was clear that he was beginning to see the value in what John had built. John quickly typed back, "I'm proud of you, Ben. Let's talk more about this. I'd be honored to have you work with me." For the first time in a long time, John felt a sense of fulfillment. The past had shaped him, but it was the present and the future that held the real promise. His relationship with Ben was mending, his work was thriving, and he was finally beginning to feel a sense of balance between his professional life and his personal life. That night, as John sat at the kitchen table, reflecting on the day, he felt a strange peace settle over him. The call from Rick had stirred something inside him, old doubts, old desires, but it also reminded him of why he had made the choice to walk away. He had given up a certain kind of success, yes. But in return, he had found something far more valuable, a life that was his own, built on hard work, integrity, and the people who truly mattered. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced at the family photo on the wall, his family, his life. This was where he belonged. No matter what the past called him back to, he knew that this was the future he wanted. And tomorrow, he would wake up to build it even further. John's phone rang the next morning, cutting through the quiet as he sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee. He glanced at the screen, already feeling a sense of dread wash over him. It was Rick again. He hesitated, wondering if he should just let it go to voicemail. But something urged him to answer. Maybe he could finally put this chapter behind him for good. "John," Rick's voice came through, sharp and insistent. "I know you think you're doing the right thing, but I need to make you an offer you can't refuse. I don't care how much pride you have, how much you've convinced yourself this is the right path. We both know what you're giving up. And if you think for a second you're going to find something better, you're wrong. You're going to be a nobody, John. You've already made that choice for yourself." John took a breath, his grip tightening on his coffee mug. The weight of Rick's words hit harder than he wanted to admit, but he stood firm, his voice unwavering. "You're wrong, Rick. I'm not looking for validation or approval anymore. I'm done chasing something that's going to burn me out. I'm living for what's real now. I've made my decision." Rick laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think that's going to make you happy? The path you're on is a dead end, John. You're playing at being a small-town contractor while I'm out here making things happen, changing lives. You'll see. When this all falls apart, you'll be right back here, begging for another shot. The words stung, but John refused to let them in. He had been here before, he had heard the same type of speech from Rick 1,000 times. But now, it felt different. John wasn't the same person he had been. He didn't need Rick or anyone else to define his worth. I don't need another shot at the life you're offering, Rick. That's not what I'm after. I'm done talking. Goodbye. Without waiting for Rick's response, John ended the call. The silence that followed felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest, but the feeling was fleeting. His thoughts immediately returned to his conversation with Ben a few days ago. His son's decision to join him in the business was still fresh in his mind, a source of both pride and uncertainty. John had spent so much time building a life, but now he was starting to realize that it was time for the next generation to carry the torch. The more he thought about it, the more he believed that Ben was ready. Ben had made the decision to embrace his roots, to come back to the family business, even when the temptation to follow a different path remained strong. John admired that strength in him. Yet, the past seemed to have a way of lurking, whispering doubts into his mind. Could Ben really handle the responsibility? Was he ready to step into a role that would demand everything from him? And was John truly ready to relinquish the reins of the business? The reality was that John had already given so much to his work, but now the balance was shifting. The focus was no longer just about the business, it was about family, legacy, and leaving something behind that was truly meaningful. Later that afternoon, as the day began to wind down, John decided to visit the site, just to check in on how things were progressing. He always found peace in the rhythm of the work, in the steady movement of progress. The site had become a symbol of his commitment to rebuilding, not just physically but emotionally and mentally. Every brick laid, every piece of wood nailed in place, felt like a step forward, a step away from the chaos of his past. Ben was already there when John arrived, sitting on a nearby bench, staring out at the half-completed building. He looked up as John approached, his face thoughtful, his brow furrowed with what seemed like concern. "Everything okay?" John asked, concern creeping into his voice. Ben stood up, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Yeah, just thinking about things. The future. I know it's going to be hard, taking over the business and all that. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About making real choices." John smiled softly. "It's a big decision, Ben. But you're not in this alone. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. What matters is that you're moving forward. You've already made a huge step by deciding to come back." Ben nodded slowly, looking at the unfinished building in front of them. "I think I've been afraid of failure, Dad. Afraid that I'm going to mess things up, or that I'm not as strong as you were. It feels like there's so much riding on this. And I don't want to disappoint you." John stepped closer to Ben, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You won't disappoint me. It's not about being perfect. It's about doing your best and learning along the way. You've already shown so much courage just by stepping into this. I'm proud of you, no matter what." Ben smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "I just need to figure out what kind of legacy I want to leave behind. It's not just about the business or making money, it's about what kind of person I want to be." John chuckled softly. "That's the big question, isn't it? But trust me, Ben, you'll figure it out. The important thing is to stay true to who you are. That's the legacy that matters." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the building. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the worksite. It felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. John could feel a shift in the air, both in the world around him and in his own heart. The past was calling, but he wasn't going to answer it. He had already walked away from that life. Now, it was time to move forward, to build something new. Not just for himself, but for Ben and the generations to come. As the two of them stood side by side, John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The path ahead might be uncertain, but one thing was clear, he was ready for it. And together with Ben, they would face whatever came next, united in their vision for the future. The morning after their conversation at the construction site, John woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The uncertainty from the days before felt lighter now. His conversation with Ben had been a turning point, not just for Ben, but for John as well. It was a reminder that life wasn't just about individual battles, it was about building something that could stand the test of time, something that could be passed down to the next generation. As he made his way to the office, John thought back to everything he had learned during his journey. The hard lessons, the failed ventures, and the fleeting moments of success, all of it had shaped him, but none of it had prepared him for the responsibility he now faced. Not just with the business, but with Ben's future and his own sense of legacy. But there was still a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, one that he couldn't shake. Despite all his growth, he knew the work ahead of him wasn't easy. No amount of reflection, no amount of hope, could change the fact that the world they were about to build together wasn't just going to be about construction, it was going to be about trust, resilience, and understanding. John arrived at the site and walked toward the scaffolding where his crew was already working. Ben was there too, his sleeves rolled up, working beside the team. The sight of his son, taking on the responsibility that John had once carried alone, filled him with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Looking good," John said as he approached Ben, watching the team work efficiently around them. Ben looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow, a grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I think it's coming together." "You were right, Dad. This is what it's all about. Not just the money, not just the business, it's about building something that lasts." John clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. I've seen you grow already, more than I expected. Just remember, the key isn't to do everything yourself. Build a team you can rely on. Lean on people who share your vision." Ben nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. They were standing on the precipice of something much bigger than themselves. The path forward would be difficult, but they weren't alone. They had each other, and that meant everything. As the day continued, the sense of camaraderie between the workers was evident. John noticed how seamlessly the crew moved together, each person performing their task with precision and dedication. It was a far cry from the chaotic, cutthroat atmosphere of his past life. This was different, this was a place of respect, of mutual trust. The more he watched, the more he felt the weight of what he had built, and what he was about to leave behind. The business had been everything for so long. But now, John was beginning to realize that it wasn't just the company that mattered. It was the people within it. That evening, as the sun began to set, Ben called him over. He was sitting on the scaffolding, his hands resting on his knees, looking out over the worksite. "I've been thinking," Ben said slowly, his voice tinged with something serious. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" John smiled, walking over to sit next to him. "We have. And we're just getting started. But there's a lot we're still figuring out. I mean, the future of this company. How do we make sure it's more than just a business? How do we make it something that's part of the community, part of the people's lives?" John leaned back, considering his son's words. It was a question he hadn't fully answered for himself yet. It wasn't enough to build something that lasted. It had to be something meaningful. "You're right," John finally said. "We can't just focus on what we build physically. We have to build relationships, trust, and a foundation in the community. If we do that, the business will grow, and it will grow in the right way." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah. I've seen businesses fail because they don't build the right kind of foundation. It's not just about building walls, it's about building people up." John's heart swelled with pride. His son was seeing things in a way that John hadn't even considered. It was this fresh perspective, this drive to create something with heart, that would shape the future of their business. The next day, John met with his team to discuss their plans for the future. They talked about expanding their reach into new neighborhoods, improving sustainability efforts, and offering more to the community. It was clear to John that the company's mission was evolving. It wasn't just about profit, it was about impact. Ben took the lead in many of the discussions, his ideas and vision starting to shine through. It was clear he had the potential to steer the company in a new direction, one that John couldn't have imagined when he first started this journey. But watching his son take charge, seeing him embrace the responsibility with passion and determination, filled John with a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in a long time. That afternoon, as John and Ben walked through the site together, Ben asked the question that had been on his mind for days. "Dad, what do you think the future holds for us? For the business?" John paused, looking at the half-built structure before them. "I think the future is in your hands, Ben. But it's also in the hands of everyone who's part of this team. We're all building something together." Ben smiled. "I just hope I can live up to what you've created. I want to make you proud." John's eyes softened. "You already have, son. You already have." As they continued their walk, John couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought him to this point. The choices he had made, the mistakes he had learned from, and the new life he was building alongside his son. It wasn't just a business anymore, it was a legacy, one that was now passing from one generation to the next. And for the first time in years, John felt at peace with the path he had chosen. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, plans, and preparations. The company was expanding rapidly, and John found himself pulled in every direction. It was a thrilling yet exhausting time. Every step forward felt like a victory, but it came with its own challenges, unexpected delays, new competitors, and the constant balancing act of family and business. But through it all, there was a sense of momentum, of things moving in the right direction. As the company's profile grew, so did its responsibilities. The team started focusing not just on the buildings they constructed but on the communities they were helping to shape. There was talk of creating affordable housing projects, of partnering with local organizations to give back in meaningful ways. For John, this was the turning point, the moment when the work they were doing transcended beyond just profit and loss. Ben, ever the visionary, spearheaded these initiatives. His drive to make a difference in the community became infectious. John had always been focused on the bottom line, but now he saw how Ben was thinking beyond that, using the company's success to foster change. The way Ben engaged with the community, listening to their needs, offering solutions that were both practical and sustainable, made John proud. His son was not just learning the business, he was transforming it. One day, as they walked through one of the new projects, Ben turned to John, a look of determination on his face. "Dad, I've been thinking," Ben said. "We have this incredible opportunity to do something bigger than just build houses. What if we could create a model that focuses on not just construction, but on the people who are going to live in these homes? We could design communities, not just buildings. Places where people thrive." John nodded thoughtfully, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had always believed in the power of architecture to change lives, but Ben was talking about something deeper, a vision that extended beyond brick and mortar. "That's a big idea," John said, his voice filled with admiration. "But I think you're onto something. If we can build communities that focus on well-being, on creating spaces where people feel supported and connected, that's a legacy worth leaving." Ben's eyes lit up with excitement. "Exactly. We could partner with local health organizations, with schools, even with social programs. Make sure everything we do has a purpose beyond just shelter. We could create a place where people feel like they belong." John couldn't help but smile. Ben had always had a way of seeing the bigger picture. It was one of the things that had set him apart from others, and it was why John knew he was ready to lead. "We'll need to bring in the right people," John said. "Architects, community leaders, social workers. It's going to take more than just us." "We'll build that team," Ben said confidently. "One step at a time." As the conversation continued, John's mind began to picture the future, a future where the company wasn't just known for its buildings, but for the lives it helped improve. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was exactly what he had been missing all along. The work had always been important, but the impact it could have on people's lives was even more significant. That evening, as John sat on the porch of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he thought about how far they had come. The business had been his life for so long, but now it was about more than just the business. It was about family, about legacy, about building something that would stand the test of time, not just in terms of brick and steel, but in terms of heart and purpose. Ben had been the catalyst for change, but John now understood that it wasn't just Ben's vision, it was their vision. Together, they were creating something that could ripple through generations, shaping the way people thought about community, about home, about what it meant to live a meaningful life. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted back to Rick's words, those harsh words that had once threatened to undo everything John had worked for. At the time, Rick's voice had felt like an insurmountable wall, but now, looking back, it seemed small and insignificant. Rick had been right about one thing: John had made choices. But those choices had led him here, to this place, where he was creating something that was truly worth fighting for. John smiled to himself, a sense of contentment filling him. He wasn't just rebuilding a business. He was rebuilding his life, his relationship with his son, and a future that had meaning. He looked at Ben, who had joined him on the porch, his gaze also fixed on the horizon. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Ben said, as if reading John's mind. John nodded. "Yeah, just the beginning. But we're on the right path, Ben. We've got something real here." Ben smiled, and for the first time, John saw in his son's eyes the same drive, the same passion he had once felt. It was a reflection of everything they had built together and everything they were about to achieve. The next day, John called a meeting with his team. The energy in the room was palpable, there was a sense of unity, a shared purpose that had never been there before. They weren't just employees, they were partners in something much bigger. John stood at the front of the room, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "We're going to do something different," he said. "We're not just going to build homes. We're going to build communities. We're going to create spaces where people thrive, where they feel safe, where they feel like they belong. And we're going to make sure that everything we do has purpose." There was a moment of silence, and then a slow ripple of applause spread through the room. People were excited, eager to be part of something meaningful. It was clear that this was the direction they had been waiting for. Ben looked at John, a silent understanding passing between them. They were no longer just father and son, they were partners in a mission that went beyond business. They were creating a future, not just for their company, but for everyone it touched. That night, as John lay in bed, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long, filled with its share of struggles, but now, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weight of his decisions had finally lifted, replaced by a sense of hope and excitement for the future. He had built a life, a legacy. And now, it was time to build something even bigger. Something that would last for generations to come. It was a crisp, clear morning, the kind of day that made John feel grateful for the chance to see another sunrise. He stepped out onto the balcony of his office, overlooking the city, and took a deep breath. The landscape before him had changed in more ways than one. What was once an urban jungle of concrete and steel now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a life that they had helped shape. He looked down at the construction site in the distance, where the foundations for a new community were being laid, and he couldn't help but feel proud of the work they were doing. But it wasn't just the buildings or the projects. It was the people. The families who would live in the homes they were building, the neighbors who would gather in the parks they were designing. This wasn't just about architecture, it was about creating spaces for life to happen, for people to connect, grow, and thrive. John had always been driven by the desire to leave a lasting mark on the world. He had always wanted to build something monumental, something that would stand the test of time. But as he looked out over the city now, he realized that the true legacy wasn't in the structures themselves, it was in the people they affected. It was in the lives they changed, the hope they inspired. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Ben walked in, holding a stack of papers and a cup of coffee. "Morning, Dad," Ben said, offering him the cup. "I thought you could use some caffeine." "Thanks," John replied, accepting the cup. He took a sip, feeling the warmth spread through him. "How's everything going on the project?" "Great," Ben said, setting the papers down on John's desk. "We're ahead of schedule, and everything's looking good. I've been talking to the community leaders, and they're really excited about what we're doing. It's like they finally see the bigger picture." John smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. "I'm proud of you, son. You've really taken this to heart. You're not just building homes, you're building futures." Ben shrugged, but there was a gleam in his eye. "I learned from the best." John chuckled. "You've surpassed me, in a lot of ways. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be learning from you." Ben's smile faded slightly as he sat down across from John. He looked at his father with a seriousness that was rare for him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about legacy. About how we're not just building for the now, but for the future." John raised an eyebrow. "That's good. That's exactly what we need to be thinking about." Ben hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Dad, I think we're on the right path. But there's still a lot of work to do. There are a lot of people who still don't have a voice. A lot of families who are struggling. I want us to do more. I want to make sure that everything we do has a purpose, not just for the people who can afford it, but for everyone." John felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known that Ben was capable, but to hear him articulate that vision with such conviction, it was a powerful moment. "We'll get there, Ben," John said quietly. "It's not going to be easy, but I believe in you. I believe in us. Together, we can change the way people think about home. About community." Ben nodded, his eyes fixed on his father. "Together, we will." As the weeks passed, the company continued to grow, and so did their impact. More projects were launched, each one aimed at addressing different needs within the community. Some focused on affordable housing for families in need. Others aimed at creating green spaces, parks, and community centers where people could come together. There were partnerships with schools, health organizations, and local nonprofits. Every step they took was a step closer to creating a legacy that would last. But even with all the progress they were making, there were challenges. There were always challenges. The world wasn't perfect, and the road to change was never smooth. There were setbacks, delays, and people who didn't understand what they were trying to do. But John and Ben kept moving forward, driven by the belief that they were building something worth fighting for. One afternoon, John received a call from the city's mayor. It had been a while since they had spoken, but the mayor's voice on the other end of the line was warm and familiar. "John," the mayor said, "I've been following your work with the company, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You and your son are doing something incredible over there. I want to help you take it to the next level. I've got some funding available for community projects, and I think it's time we made a real investment in what you're doing." John's heart swelled with gratitude. "That means a lot, Mayor. Thank you. But we're just getting started. There's so much more we can do." "I know," the mayor replied. "And I believe in what you're doing. Let's make it happen." As John hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of hope. They weren't just building homes anymore, they were building relationships, building bridges between people and the spaces they lived in. They were creating a foundation for something that would outlast them all. Later that evening, as he sat at dinner with Ben, John couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The years of struggle, the moments of doubt, the sacrifices they had all made, it had all led to this. They had created something that was about more than just themselves. They had created a community, a legacy, a future. "Dad," Ben said, breaking the silence, I was thinking about the future. I think we should start thinking about how we can expand beyond just our city. There are other places that need what we're doing, places that don't have the resources we have. Maybe it's time we take our vision and our mission to new cities. John looked at Ben, his eyes filled with pride. You're right. There's always more to be done. But we've come a long way, and I think we're ready for the next step. Together, we can take this to new heights. Ben smiled, his determination mirrored in his father's eyes. Let's build something that will last forever, Dad. Let's make the world a better place. John raised his glass in a silent toast to the future, to the work that was yet to be done, and to the legacy that would continue long after they were gone. For the first time in years, John felt the weight of his past lift. The business, the struggles, the sacrifices, it had all led him to this moment. And in that moment, he knew one thing for sure: together, they would continue building. Not just buildings, but communities. Not just homes, but futures. And that was the legacy that would last. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?